And I'm just going to hit the record button now. Fantastic. So welcome back. Can everyone see my screen? Is that all up okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So welcome back to the third session about research skills and social care. So today we're going to be talking about appraising studies. And you may remember from the last session, we looked at where to look for evidence and how to build a search strategy. We looked at where we look for evidence, we looked at where we can get, we looked at finding freely available academic databases, we looked at individual company websites, government websites, and subscribed databases. We looked at how we'd navigate databases using mesh terms and subject headings and Boolean operators and things like that. We looked at how we'd build a search strategy. It's how we'd map out key concepts, different spellings, regional terms, and things like that. And we looked at building a search strategy on open databases, so non-subscribed, freely available databases. Today, we're going to be looking at, hopefully by the end of today, you'll know how to organise your articles. You'll understand why appraisal is important. And also you'll be able to find and use appraisal tools when you're appraising the articles that you're including in your review. So there's a few steps that we're going to cover in today's session. We're going to start by how we'd review titles and abstracts, how we'd review full text, and how we do our actual critical appraisal. The first thing we need to do is we need to prepare to appraise. Last session, you may or may not remember, we ended with a diagram that looked a little bit like this. So this was part of a PRISMA diagram, which stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. Not the catchiest name, better to just call it PRISMA. More information on this can be found following the reference that will be at the end of the session, and also just for searching PRISMA reporting standards. You can see that in our review, we had 7,319 studies going into stage 1, which are title and abstract review. And as our review was quite large, we're using a piece of software called Covidence. And this is just a piece of software that helps us manage it between different team members. As if you're doing this on your own or doing a review on your own, you'll likely handle this a little bit differently. And I would normally recommend doing this within referencing software. So you need to be able to keep track of all of your articles and your results, and this is where referencing software comes in really handy. The most popular programs are usually Zotero, Mendeley, and EndNote. Both Zotero and Mendeley are freely available. You can make a free online account, and then there is an option to download the software as a desktop version. EndNote generally is paid for and is normally fairly expensive, so you normally only have access to that if you're part of a wider organisation. If you're a member of staff at Portsmouth City Council, you can have Zotero installed on your work laptop by filling out a specific form from IT, although I don't know exactly what form that is just at the moment. The different programs are very similar, although they do look a bit different. I normally use EndNote just because that's what I've always used. But today I'll show you how to use Zotero to manage your literature review. So to be using Zotero to track your article references, you do need to be using the desktop version. However, you'll still need to use the website to create an online account. You create your account just by heading to the website and hitting register for an account. Your homepage will look a little bit like this, and where it says web library is where, if you're using the online version, all of your references would be stored. But from now on, I'll be showing you how to use it as a desktop version. And I'm going to put that to the side. Now you've created your account, I'll put that to the side just for the moment. We'll go back to our search that we ran in the last session and get our search results up. Web of Science is normally one of the more difficult databases to get your results out of, unless you're using EndNote, because they sync really well. They're made by the same company. But I'll show you how to do it on the hard one. So what we need to do is we need to select all of our results. You can see there's at that point, there's only 50 out of 1,800 selected. We need to make sure we've got all 1,800 selected. Unfortunately, this means going through each page and ensuring that box is checked until all the results have been selected. What we'll do next is press the export button, and we want to export a RIS file. I have no idea what RIS stands for, and I did try to find out, but I couldn't find out, unfortunately. I obviously didn't look hard enough. As a rule, when we're talking about saving, exporting, and importing references, we want them to be RIS files. And that's because most referencing software can read RIS files, whereas the other file types will normally only be used by specific referencing softwares. So you'll get to a page that looks a little bit like this. You want to make sure that you are exporting either the full record, which means all of the information the database has for the article, or the author, title, source, and abstract, and then you press export. It might take a moment, but you'll get a little file that pops up in your downloads, and it will just be the one file. So the next thing we do is we get back to our Zotero desktop app. We'll go to File and then hit Import. We find our RIS file from a moment ago, which will be somewhere in your downloads, and probably make a cup of tea while it does its thing, because it might take a minute to organize them all and make sense of it all. And then you'll end up with all of those results from your search saved and stored nicely in your Zotero library. You can see that when you click on a title, it brings up all of the information that's just been exported from the database. So it has the title, the authors, the abstract, the publication, the volume, issue number, all of that reference information and bibliographic information is now saved within your referencing software. For our final bit of preparation before we start reviewing our titles and abstracts, you see that I've created two folders. I've got one for exclude and one for include for full text review. We are now prepared to start reviewing after we've got all of those steps done. So a quick reminder of what our research question was. We were looking at what contextual factors and mechanisms support collaborative social care services to achieve preferred outcomes for older adults. And we defined these terms in our last session and the first session, I believe. But something we've danced around the last couple of sessions is our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So defining those terms helps us develop our inclusion and exclusion criteria. From our definitions, we know what kind of studies we want to include and what we want those studies to have in them. We want them to be talking about social workers. We want them to be talking about at least one other discipline. But we're not going to specifically name those disciplines because there might be some that we haven't considered that are regularly part of multidisciplinary or collaborative teams. We want them to be working together to support an adult who's 65 plus. And we want them to be providing descriptive accounts of the service because of the type of review we're doing and the type of information we're looking for to make our conclusions. We want them to give contextual information, and we want them to provide really clear detail on the methods that they've undertaken. We also have a number of things we don't want to include, such as things like student social workers or social work education, single discipline silo services, when studies are talking about integrating theories and concepts into broader social work practice, and other literature reviews. We don't want to include those because they're not going to provide the information that we're looking for to make conclusions and answer our research question. So you've got your inclusion and exclusion criteria. The first thing you want to do is identify any duplicates. I've mentioned before, but where we ran our search on multiple databases, you'll likely have some results that were the same. Identifying duplicates is done really easily and automatically in Zotero, but it does tell you how many duplicates it's found, and you need to make sure you write that information down because it will be a useful piece of information later. You then develop your pilot and screening tool, and this will just be a physical reminder of what your inclusion and exclusion criteria are. You can add explanations, definitions, any information that helps you decide what is or isn't relevant. This is just like your cheat sheet that tells you that you can refer back to when you're reviewing studies. And now you need to compare your abstracts and titles against your inclusion and exclusion criteria in your screening tool. This can be really time consuming and quite labor intensive, but it is relatively simple. In Zotero, we've got our search results and we've prepared by setting up our two folders. We've got our exclude folder and include for full text review. And all we're going to do now is we're going to look at the title and we're going to look at the abstract of each article and ask ourselves if it meets the inclusion criteria. So for this result, we can see that it refers to nurses working with social workers in a multidisciplinary approach to support older adults. From the abstract, we can't assess any of our other inclusion criteria, but we can assume that it's probably going to be a useful one to read the full text of and reevaluate once we've read the full text. So because of that, I would put this in the include for full text review folder. And all we do to do that is just drag and drop that record into our full text review folder. It won't disappear from the library, but it will appear in the include folder. So it's just a really simple drag and drop, and then it will be saved in that include folder. The next task we have to complete once we've been through all of our titles and abstracts is we have to then review full text. So we should now have a lovely list of articles that we want to review the full text for, and then it's time to do a little bit more legwork because we need to actually find our full text versions of our articles. Luckily, Zotero and most other referencing software can do part of the job for us. If we highlight all of our articles in Zotero and right click, we'll find that we get a little option called Find Available PDFs. Once we click on this, Zotero will automatically start searching for PDF or full text versions of the articles we want. You can see here it's found 9 out of 10, which is great. However, not all the ones it's found are freely accessible. So sometimes it will find ones that are behind a paywall or that you need a subscription to that particular journal to access. And it will just give you a link to where you can sign up and get a subscription to access it if you want. When you come across an article that you want to review for full text, but you can't actually access it, I would always start by just Googling the author's names and or the article title. Sometimes you'll find that there's a copy available on the author's institutional website. There's often institutional repositories that have copies of articles and things like that. And if you can't find an open access copy anywhere, remember you can always email the author directly. Again, probably more than happy to send you a copy. Or you can always look on ResearchGate, which we talked about in the last session, and see if there's a full text PDF version on there. There's our little ResearchGate logo. When you're reviewing your full text, you will need to carefully read each article in full and compare it against your inclusion and exclusion criteria. This can be in a spreadsheet or a Word document or a piece of paper, as long as it's, I've written that down wrong. So you need to carefully read them, but you need to write down which studies you're excluding and why. You need to write that down somewhere safe, and it can be in a spreadsheet, it can be in a table, and a Word document can be on a piece of paper that you have pinned to your wall, as long as it's not something you are likely to lose, because you do need to keep a record of what you're excluding and why you're excluding it, particularly at this stage. It's not so important in the title and abstract review stage. You can organize your articles in Zotero the same as we did before, create a folder for include for analysis and exclude, and then move each article into the appropriate folder once you've read it. At the end of this step, you should have a number of articles that you'll analyze in the next stage. But before we get to that, we need to do the tricky bit, which is the critical appraisal. So critical appraisal is just a structured technique to help you objectively assess the quality of published research reports and interpret the findings. It helps you make sense of research evidence and put that knowledge into practice. It's about looking at how valid that research is and how rigorously it was carried out. We use critical appraisal to determine best evidence and to understand the methodology and results of research and to assess the quality of research. It does not give you a right answer. It doesn't say, it won't tell you that this is a poorly conducted piece of research or this is a really good piece of research. It's all very context dependent and it depends upon what the question is and what you might be using the results for. There are three main questions we need to be asking ourselves when we are critically appraising a study. So something you'd start with asking, how trustworthy is this research? What is the research telling us? What are the results telling us? And also, how useful will this research be to my practice or research question? How relevant is it? Critical appraisal is not the same as criticizing a paper. It's not about saying what's wrong with it or what could be improved. It's rather about evaluating its strengths and weaknesses. And can we trust it? What can we learn from it? And is it relevant to us right now? So your average article will look something like this, although it's probably spread out over more pages. The abstract is like the article elevator pitch. This should contain all of your key points, but it won't necessarily give you enough information to assess the article. The introduction and the background are often they're sometimes separate, mostly together. They will introduce the topic and give a sort of an overview of the current situation and the context of the research that's being described. These bits can talk about things like existing research, policy, laws, and things like that. And then our methods. When you're critically appraising a study, this is where you'll likely spend most of your time. The methods are the research recipe that tell you how to reconstruct the study and help you identify the impact the methods may have on the findings. This information should be purely factual, literally like reading a recipe. And it should give you enough information to understand any potential impact the methods have on the findings, as I said. And it should help you identify any issues. And then more often have the findings, which will sometimes be called the results. This should again provide a factual account of the analysis and the results. There shouldn't normally be theory and interpretation here, although there sometimes it is in qualitative research studies. Sometimes authors like to give some theory and discussion as they're relaying their findings to kind of help make sense of it. And that can be perfectly normal. The discussion is normally where you'll find interpretation and comparisons and contrasts with other research and the findings. There'll normally be some kind of discussion of what the implications are for practice and research. And there might be an argument for what the research adds in the next steps going forward. This can sometimes also kind of merge with the conclusion, which is normally just a sentence or two with the key points of the article and any sort of key messages. For each section, there's specific questions we'll be asking ourselves. So we're looking at the abstract. We'll be asking, is this research relevant to my practice or the research question? Do I want to read the whole paper? With the introduction and the background, you're thinking, is the rationale clearly stated? Is the research question clearly stated? Is the relevance to practice clear? And does the research intend to add things that are already known? Is it filling a gap in knowledge or is it just repeating something that we already know? The methods, you'll be thinking, is the study design appropriate for the research question? Were the participants sampled appropriately? And are there any method-specific considerations? So specific methods, when they're used, will have specific considerations or specific issues that need to be thought about and discussed. With the findings, you're thinking, are the key findings clear? Are they presented appropriately? What are they? And with the discussion, you're thinking, do the author's interpretations make sense? Does the research answer the question it sought to answer? Have they identified any strengths and limitations study, and were all of the important outcomes considered? Is there anything that you think has been missed? That and do you agree with the interpretations and the conclusions that the authors have come to? And it's very similar in the conclusion. You're thinking, are the key findings stated? And do you agree with the recommendations and conclusions that they're suggesting? So you may be thinking that this is a lot of questions, and you may have also noticed that critical appraisal requires you to make a judgment on the use of research methods, which you may or may not be comfortable doing, especially if you don't have much experience with research methods. And you'll be pleased to know that there are guides to help you with what questions to ask and what the answers mean. And also, they also normally give some advice on what is appropriate. For mixed methods research, you can use one tool that's called the Mixed Methods Appraisal tool. And this gives you a variety of questions with tick boxes for different types of research. So you have yes or no or can't tell. This tool can also be quite handy if you just want to use it as a guide for appraising different types of research, as it has questions that you might want to ask of different study types, such as qualitative research or different types of quantitative research. So you can pick and choose the questions that are appropriate for the paper you're assessing. You don't have to answer every single question. If you're using it for different types of research, if you're using this tool for, say, all of the results that you find in your literature review, it also has a good flow chart that helps you decide what questions are appropriate for what studies. This is generally the tool that I would recommend for people who are quite new to critically appraising research. And some of the questions that it has, and these are some examples from the qualitative section. If we look at the first one, which is the qualitative approach appropriate to answer the research question? This means that this is asking you whether the actual approach to collecting data is likely to be useful for answering the question that's stated in that paper. For example, if the research question is, how do staff in multidisciplinary teams reach a decision on the best care for an older adult with complex needs? One study might choose to use ethnographic methods, where the researcher sits in the meetings and observes the behaviours and the interactions of staff and takes field notes and then analyses those notes later. This would collect lots of valid data about that decision-making process and about lots of different things that are going on at the same time. Whereas another study might choose to answer that question by interviewing directors of the service to elicit their opinions. Directors may not be actually involved in those decision-making meetings, therefore valid representations of decision-making in the resulting data might be missed. It might not give an accurate representation of how that decision-making process actually takes place. So what that's asking is the methods they've undertaken appropriate for the question that needs to be answered? The next question, are the qualitative data collection methods adequate to address the research question? And this is about understanding sort of whether or not there's, excuse me, I'll start that again. So this is about whether the methods used are enough to answer that question. So for example, if the research question was about understanding the experiences of older adults receiving multidisciplinary care, one research study might hold one-to-one interviews with the service users, which were audio recorded using a dictaphone and then transcribed word for analysis. Whereas another study might hold one-to-one interviews with service users, but rather than recording them, they rely on notes that are taken by the researcher after the interview is finished. The latter method might miss a lot of data, and there might be a lot of information that the researcher's forgotten or doesn't have time to write down. And that might mean that when that data is analysed, there's not enough of an examination of what was said, and lots of data is missed. When it's asking are the findings adequately derived from the data, this means is it clear from reading the methods how the researchers got from the point of data collection to their final set of themes or key findings. There's lots of different ways of doing this, of analysing data and coming up with those key findings. And one type of study will differ from the next, but hopefully their method section will give you a reasonable idea of the process they undertook. What this is asking you is do you trust that their findings are representative of the data they've collected, or is it possible that they've set out to prove a point and cherry-picked the data that helped them make that point? Some examples of things you might look for here would be if the researchers are being reflexive in their analysis, or if they're aiming to recognise how their own experiences and viewpoints may have shaped the data analysis. And if they acknowledge and discuss unusual cases that don't fit their initial themes and their analysis. So looking for rival or alternative explanations and viewpoints in their data. Sometimes researchers will also have something like a critical friend or a second person that sort of polices that analysis or supports that analysis to try and help avoid that bias and that cherry picking. And then is the interpretation of results sufficiently substantiated by data? Here you'd be looking for some illustrative quotes, for example, that back up the author's themes, so you can see that their interpretations appear justified. There might be a lack of quotes, so you don't know, you can't tell whether it's sufficient, whether the themes make sense with the data that's collected, and then you might say, well, no, I don't think it's sufficiently substantiated because I can't evidence that and I can't see that. And then finally, is there coherence between the qualitative data sources collection, analysis, and interpretation? And that's asking sort of, does it make sense with the data, that with the methods that have been chosen, that they've reached the conclusions they've reached? So for example, if a study wanted to explore older adults' experiences of receiving care, but their data sources, they carried out interviews with social workers and not the older adults themselves, you'd be thinking, well, did the research collect information that would actually answer that question? Did it actually achieve what it set out to do, and were those methods appropriate and in doing that? There are other tools you can use. So one that's quite frequently used is called the CASP tools, which is the Critical Appraisal Skills Program. They have a variety of tools to appraise different research methods. I've put some examples here. They also provide training materials and a very useful glossary that can help you identify studies. So if you're not sure what kind of study you've got in front of you and how to appraise it, they will normally have some kind of explanation of how you decide what tool to use. Each tool will have a series of specific questions with hints that help you identify what an appropriate answer would be. It's really important to try and find a tool that's for the type of the study design that you're appraising, as the questions are tailored to the study type. If you pick the wrong tool, it might be like asking whether a fish is good at climbing trees, instead of whether it's good at swimming. Another resource you can use is the Joanna Briggs Institute. So like the others, JBI checklists have a series of specific questions with tick boxes. They also give guidance on each question and give you hints about what you might be looking for to assess that particular point. So as you can see, there's different tools there for different types of studies that you might be appraising. So with critical appraisal, there's a couple of things worth noting here. And I know I said it before, but critical appraisal does not give you the right answer. I just want to reiterate that. There is no real objective outcome from critical appraisal tools. The critical appraisal is based on your opinion. And if you critique a study, you need to be able to justify why you think that. The tools are meant to be used as a guide, but they will not replace your own thoughts and opinions. And refining these thoughts and opinions when critically appraising is a learning process and a skill that develops over time. it can be really helpful to set up things like workplace or peer group journal clubs. And this would be where you get together as a group and discuss an article together. This is normally particularly helpful because hearing the views and perspectives of others can help you narrow down what you think and help you put it into words. You won't always agree. You probably won't agree a lot of the time, and that's okay. When you're doing a systematic review, or in a lot of systematic reviews, the critical appraisal is often completed by two independent individuals who assess the same article using the same tool without discussing it first. They will then submit their decisions, and if they disagree, they'll discuss it between them and try and sort of come to a conclusion. Sometimes in some systematic reviews, a third person will be appointed to resolve conflicts. So they are to an extent expected. So what next? You may have had some papers that seemed relevant when you first read them, but now you've appraised them, you can see that they're actually not relevant and they should be discarded. Ideally, they would have been discarded at an earlier stage, but it's okay to discard them at this point. And then you can take a break and prepare for your analysis, because you've got your papers, you know how much you can trust the information that's in them. And the next step is to start getting ready to go through them line by line, but that will be for the next session. We won't go through that today. So what we've done today is we've had a quick overview of how you can organise your articles to review them. We've had a quick talk about why appraisal is important, and you should now be able to find and use some of the appraisal tools, or have a go at applying them to some academic articles. So our next session will be on the 15th of May, and this is where we'll start talking about how we analyse our findings, how we analyse the studies we've got, and how we get those together and synthesize that into overall themes and findings. If you want to catch up on any of the session recordings, you can use this lovely QR code to find them on YouTube, which is very strange to think I have a YouTube channel. And you can also use this QR code to scan through to the Open Science Framework, where there's videos and there's also copies of the slides along with the written script and sort of links to some of the tools and things that I've mentioned throughout the sessions. If you'd like to give feedback on the session, that would be great. We would like all kinds of feedback. Anything that you can tell us, we'll be happy to hear. So there's another lovely QR code, because I really enjoy making them. I think they're quite fun and I'm enjoying the new technology. And here's our references. And again, these will be up on the Open Science Framework, so you can copy and paste them if there's anything else you want to do a bit more reading into. Other than that, thank you very much for attending, and hopefully I will see you next time on the 15th of May. Does anyone have any questions at all?
Can you just go back a slide so I can scan that code, please?
Yes, of course. The feedback one?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I get quick enough.
Right, thank you very much, everyone. If you don't have any questions, I will let you go until next time. And I will